The machine said I was unconscious. My family said they wished I wouldn't wake up. They were wrong on both counts, and that single, irreversible mistake cost them everything they had so carefully calculated to inherit. But I'm getting far ahead of myself. A man does not arrive at the edge of the abyss without first walking a long, paved road of illusions. My name is Arthur Pendelton. I am 58 years old, and until that Tuesday in late August, I believed I understood the architecture of my own life. I lived in Harrogate, North Yorkshire, in a fine, four-bedroom detached house situated on the tranquil expanse of Coldbath Road. It was a proper home, earned through decades of unyielding labor and quiet sacrifice. Back in 2001, I had built a mid-sized logistics company, Pendelton Logistics Ltd., out of a modest, unglamorous office space near Leeds Road. By the time the calendar turned to 2024, that small enterprise had expanded into 47 dedicated employees, 3 major regional warehouse contracts, and a healthy revenue stream that brought a quiet smile to my accountant's face at the end of every financial quarter. I say have as though it were still the present, but the grammar of my existence shifted violently the moment the glass shattered. From the outside looking in, my world was an exquisite portrait of domestic and professional fulfillment. There was Eleanor, my wife of 30 years, who had stood by my side through the lean, desperate years of our youth and the prosperous years of our maturity. There was our son, Julian, 28, whose loose affiliation with the company mostly consisted of forwarding corporate emails and turning up with a glass in hand at the annual Christmas do. There was our daughter, Beatrice, 25, who lived 20 minutes away in the historic market town of Knaresborough and graced me with telephone calls primarily when her accounts required replenishment. And finally, there was Marcus Cooper, 35. Sandra had brought him into our lives when he was merely a toddler, the offspring of a fleeting romance with a man who vanished into the margins of society. I raised Marcus from the age of 6, clothed him, educated him, treated him with the fierce devotion of a biological father, and ultimately appointed him as my operations director. We never bothered with formal adoption papers because blood, I naively believed, was measured by devotion rather than paperwork. Then came the night that fractured the timeline. It was a Tuesday in late August, the heavy Yorkshire air holding onto the residual warmth of the summer evening long after the sun had dipped below the horizon. I had spent long, grueling hours at the Leeds Road office, managing a complex supply chain transition that should have been handled by the younger management team. I left my desk at precisely 9:40 in the evening. I remember glancing down on my mobile phone while waiting for the signals to shift on the 61 arterial road, noting a brief text message from Eleanor informing me that tea was kept warm in the oven. The final sensory memory etched into my consciousness is the amber light flickering to green, the quiet purr of the engine as I pulled forward into the junction, and then absolute, cataclysmic nothingness. A heavy commercial vehicle, traveling well above the speed limit, ignored the traffic signals and struck the driver's side of my vehicle with terrifying velocity. The paramedics later informed me that I was extraordinarily fortunate to draw breath at all, attributing my survival to the heavy-duty seatbelt and the rigid frame of the car. They spoke of trauma responses, neurological bruising, and emergency intervention, technical terms meant to comfort the living while I remained suspended in the dark. They transported me swiftly to the Harrogate District Hospital, wheeling my broken body directly into the intensive care unit on the 3rd floor. My active life of commerce, leadership, and paternal devotion was instantly compressed into the sterile, rhythmic beeping of a bedside monitor. I had stepped out of my office as a prosperous master of my own destiny, only to reemerge within the silent, enclosed walls of an ICU room as a ghost inhabiting a broken shell, utterly unaware that the people keeping vigil at my bedside were already measuring the depth of my grave. There is a particular, chilling architecture to being trapped inside the cage of one's own flesh, a condition the medical world clinicalizes as a locked-in state, though no clinical term can adequately capture the profound isolation of a conscious mind marooned within an unresponsive body. Popular imagination often romanticizes comas as a peaceful slumber, a gentle drifting away into a dreamless night. The reality is far more agonizing. Neurology reveals that while visual pathways and motor control remain severed by trauma, the auditory cortex is frequently among the first faculties to reignite. Long before a finger can twitch or an eyelid can flutter, hearing awakens with crystal, horrifying clarity. I was acutely present, reduced to an invisible eavesdropper forced to inhabit a silent, darkened chamber with no doors, no windows, and no escape, condemned to listen to the world moving on without me. By the third day following the collision, my universe had shrunk to the sterile confines of the intensive care unit on the third floor of Harrogate District Hospital. Through the steady, rhythmic hissing of ventilators and the relentless, mechanical ping of heart monitors, I began to map my surroundings through sound alone. I learned to recognize the swift, rubber-soled footsteps of the nursing staff, the sharp clink of metallic instruments on trays, and the low, professional murmur of clinical consultations. But it was the arrival of familiar voices that pierced the haze of my confinement, turning my medical sanctuary into a tribunal of betrayal. On that third morning, amid the muffled commotion of the hospital ward, the timbre of a consultant physician cut through the air, addressing Eleanor with measured, grave precision regarding my neurological trajectory. What followed shattered the fragile foundation of my 30-year marriage with the merciless velocity of falling glass. Standing beside my bed, Eleanor engaged the consultant in a dialogue so chillingly transactional might have been conducted across a bank counter rather than beside her husband's deathbed. When the physician outlined the cautious optimism of improving brain activity balanced against the prolonged uncertainty of unconsciousness, Eleanor seamlessly steered the conversation toward the eventual termination of care. Her tone carried no tremor of grief, no heavy burden of despair. It was the voice of a woman methodically pruning a dead branch from a garden shrub. When the consultant introduced the option of a do not attempt resuscitation order should my heart falter, Eleanor did not hesitate. She did not seek a second opinion, nor did she falter in her resolve. With a casual calm that rivaled a customer ordering a routine prescription, she consented to sign away the very safeguard meant to protect my breath. Inside the suffocating darkness of my body, my soul tore apart at the seams. Every fiber of my being recoiled in a silent, violent shriek of disbelief and horror as I listened to the woman I had cherished, protected, and provided for through every storm of our adult lives casually barter with my mortality. 30 years of shared history. The lean beginnings in 2001, the quiet triumphs of building Pendelton logistics, the shared laughter across kitchen tables in our Cold Bath Road home, were instantly vaporized by a single stroke of a pen. I heard the sharp, definitive click of a plastic biro cap sealing shut, the mechanical scratch of ink meeting paper, formalizing my execution right there beside my pillows. I was utterly paralyzed, forbidden from gasping, weeping, or crying out in protest, forced to lie motionless while the person who should have fought tooth and nail for my survival willingly signed my death warrant, as though completing a tedious administrative chore. The shadows had barely lengthened across the linoleum floor of the intensive care unit when the door swung open to admit the full assembly of my domestic ruin. Eleanor returned that evening accompanied by Julian, Beatrice, and Marcus, transforming the sterile sanctuary of medical recovery into an antechamber for vultures. As the heavy metal legs of the visitor chairs scraped harshly against the floor and the familiar, casual opening of a canned beverage punctured the solemn quiet of the ward, I realized that the morning's betrayal was merely the overture. Beatrice was the first to give voice to the cold, resentment festering beneath their polished exteriors. Standing near the foot of my bed, she sighed with an exaggerated, heavy irritation, not the sorrowful lament of a daughter gazing upon an injured father, but the bitter annoyance of someone inconvenienced by a delayed railway service. She complained openly to Eleanor about the arduous disruption of her personal schedule, lamenting the tedious burden of driving back and forth between her residence in Knaresborough and the hospital wards of Harrogate every 2 days, as though my fight for survival were an uninvited imposition on her social calendar. Julian chimed in with his characteristic callousness, brushing aside his sister's superficial complaints to steer the discourse toward far more lucrative horizons. With the detached composure of an estate agent appraising a derelict property, my 28-year-old son began speculating on the precise timing of probate clearance and the immediate activation of the family trust. I listened in horror as Julian casually disclosed a chilling violation of my private sanctum. He confessed to having secretly rummaged through the locked filing cabinets inside my study at the Cold Bath Roadhouse nearly a year prior, methodically auditing my private papers to calculate his exact financial share upon my demise. He had essentially penciled my funeral into his personal planner as a scheduled liquidity event, eagerly anticipating the day when my life's work would be converted into disposable capital for his leisure. Deep within the paralyzed prison of my own anatomy, a profound, soul-crushing despair cascaded through my consciousness. Every drop of sweat, every sleepless night of corporate anxiety, every calculated risk taken while building Pendelton logistics from a cramped room on Leeds Road into an enterprise supporting 47 families. All of it had been reduced to a crude ledger of liquid assets in the minds of the children I had nurtured. The infinite sacrifices born of paternal love were brutally stripped of their humanity and recast as mere stepping stones toward their financial independence. To them, I was no longer a father, a husband, or a living soul fighting for breath. I was simply a maturing bond whose expiration date they were impatiently waiting to cash in. Over the span of the next 4 days, the intensive care unit ceased to be a place of clinical recovery and instead transformed into an inescapable theater of psychological torment, where the illusion of our domestic harmony was systematically shredded piece by piece. Trapped behind unreactive eyes and a silent throat, I was forced to endure an unremitting audit of my own execution, listening as the individuals I had cherished erected the scaffolding of their new, unencumbered lives upon my supposed ruin. Julian made no secret of his predatory ambitions, utilizing the quiet hours near my bedside to place hushed telephone calls to commercial estate agents in Leeds. Speaking with an eager, hurried whisper, he instructed brokers to shortlist high-end residential flats and investment properties that could be secured immediately upon the clearance of probate and the liquidity of my estate, treating my prospective death as an opportune window for a property acquisition spree. Beatrice proved no less ruthless in her tactical calculations, turning her attention toward the tangible monuments of our marital history. In hushed, conspiratorial tones shared with Eleanor, she openly deliberated over the architectural reorganization and imminent sale of our 4-bedroom, detached home on Cold Bath Road. She argued that the estate was far too expansive for a single occupant, mapping out structural modifications and downsizing strategies that could be enacted the moment my belongings were cleared away, treating my lifelong sanctuary as an inconvenient footprint waiting to be erased. Yet, the most agonizing blow came not from my biological offspring, but from Marcus Cooper, the man I had rescued from the margins of poverty, mentored through every tier of corporate leadership, and ultimately elevated to the position of operations director at Pendelton Logistics Limited, standing near the edge of my bed with the calculating composure of a seasoned predator. Marcus addressed Eleanor with a chilling clinical detachment. He calmly asserted his absolute readiness to take absolute control of the enterprise, outlining a smooth corporate transition that would purge my influence entirely, speaking of my lifetime labor with the detached indifference of a hostile takeover specialist. Listening to his calculated appraisal of my company, the very business I had built from a single cramped room on Leeds Road to support 47 families, a profound, absolute frost settled deep within the chambers of my soul. The warmth of human affection, paternal devotion, and 30 years of sacrificial love evaporated completely, replaced by an immutable, glacial numbness. In that sterile room, buried beneath the mechanical rhythm of the ventilator, the father and husband I once was quietly perished, leaving behind an entity forged entirely from ice, vengeance, and unyielding clarity. The 7th day of August arrived, heavy with the oppressive Yorkshire heat that managed to press its warmth even through the thick, insulated walls of Harrogate District Hospital. It was on this fateful day that the rigid ice encasing my consciousness shattered. Without warning, the neurological firewall gave way, and my eyelids fluttered open, blinking against the harsh fluorescent glare of the intensive care unit. The senior nurse stationed near the doorway froze mid-step, her breath catching in a gasp of genuine astonishment that quickly dissolved into professional urgency. Within minutes, a consultant physician rushed to my bedside, deploying a battery of rapid neurological evaluations to test the cognitive architecture of a mind presumed lost. He fired off a sequence of precise inquiries. What year is it? Who currently holds the office of Prime Minister? Can you firmly squeeze my fingers? Each question was met with crisp, unhesitating mental clarity. Every command was executed with deliberate precision, proving that behind the pale, exhausted facade, my intellect remained sharper and more lethal than ever before. 20 minutes later, Eleanor swept back through the hospital doors, completely unaware that the ghost she had mentally buried had just clawed its way back into the realm of the living. The moment she crossed the threshold and gazed upon my open eyes, her facial expression fractured into a complex choreography of deceit. Relief bloomed across her features, a genuine, human reaction to a husband cheating death. Yet flickering immediately beneath that surface layer was a dark, unmistakable flash of sheer, unadulterated panic. It was the frantic terror of a criminal caught red-handed, an instantaneous realization that her meticulously mapped trajectory toward financial freedom had just collapsed in on itself. The mask of sorrow vanished so quickly that if I had not spent the preceding days dissecting her soul in the dark, I might have convinced myself it was merely a trick of the glaring lights. She rushed forward, throwing her arms around my stiffening shoulders, burying her face against my chest while soft, theatrical sobs echoed in my ears. I was so terribly scared, she wept, her voice trembling with manufactured anguish. I raised my arms, wrapping them around her back in a reciprocal embrace, and whispered the poisoned words into her hair. I know. I am so wonderfully lucky to have you. Every single syllable that crossed my lips was a calculated, colossal falsehood, the first outright deception of our 30-year marriage. Yet, as I held the woman who had signed away my life while secretly plotting my ruin, a profound, chilling sense of calm washed over me. For the first time since the glass shattered on the A61, I felt entirely at peace with the lie. The theater had officially begun, and my silence was no longer a prison of helplessness. It was the deadliest weapon in the room. The discharge from Harrogate District Hospital came on a crisp, bright morning that felt entirely too cheerful for the architecture of deceit being erected around me. Stepping back across the threshold of our 4-bedroom detached residence on Cold Bath Road felt less like a homecoming and more like an actor returning to a stage mid-performance, where every single participant had already memorized their deceptive lines and rehearsed their hollow marks. The Welcome Home Committee had staged a performance worthy of a theatrical tragedy. Julian played his assigned part with practiced nonchalance, hoisting my overnight bag over his shoulder with an exaggerated display of filial helpfulness. Beatrice greeted me with a forced, brittle smile, thrusting a bouquet of bright yellow chrysanthemums into my hands. Flowers she should have known I had detested for decades, yet an oversight entirely consistent with someone performing affection rather than feeling it. Marcus stood framed in the front hallway, his posture rigid, shaking my hand with both of his in that performative display of corporate warmth, offering a pitch-perfect greeting of, "Welcome back, Arthur." We were worried sick. I smiled at every single one of them, matching their hollow theater with a masterclass of my own. Welcome back, indeed. I was back, all right, and encased within the quiet armor of my silence. I possessed absolute immunity and all the time in the world. During the second week of my supposed convalescence, I deliberately curated the persona of a broken man. I moved through our rooms with calculated fragility, leaning heavily on door frames, complaining of lingering neurological fatigue, and maintaining the illusion of a mind too dim and a body too frail to re-engage with the rigorous demands of Pendelton logistics. The strategy yielded immediate, intoxicating results. Eleanor swallowed the performance whole, her vigilance evaporating overnight, a glaring testament to how thoroughly checked out of my emotional world she had been for years. Julian retreated back to his leisurely pursuits of golf and social inertia, convinced his inheritance was simply ticking along on a delayed timer. Beatrice checked in through brief, perfunctory text messages every few days, satisfying her minimal domestic obligations. And Marcus, wrapping himself in a cloak of supreme arrogance, assured me daily, "Take all the time you need to recover, Arthur. I have complete control over the office." "I am certain you do." Marcus, I would think, swallowing the ash of his betrayal. Yet, beneath this cloak of harmless invalidism, the real work was unfolding in the shadows. My very first covert act of survival bypassed Tom Briggs, the complacent family solicitor over on Station Square who had managed our documents for 15 years and whom I instinctively suspected had been sharing pleasantries and confidences with Eleanor. I required someone pristine, someone untainted by our social circle, a professional whose loyalty belonged exclusively to the letter of the law. Through a discreet referral from a trusted university contemporary, I located Alastair Vance, a seasoned solicitor operating out of an understated, unpretentious office tucked away in St. Mary's Square. Vance possessed the steady, unblinking gaze of a man who had unraveled human depravity 1,000 times over in a handshake that carried the weight of absolute authority. I sat across his mahogany desk on a rainy Tuesday morning, the hum of traffic outside providing a muted soundtrack to my retribution, and delivered the instruction that set the machinery of justice in motion. "I require an exhaustive, forensic investigation to determine whether my family is systematically stripping me of my life's work, and I need you to operate under the working assumption that the answer is unequivocally yes." Alastair Vance did not blink, did not offer hollow words of comfort, and did not flinch. He simply opened a clean ledger and replied, "Then let us uncover the truth." The gears of retribution, once oiled by absolute certainty and legal precision, move with a cold, unstoppable momentum. Following my initial clandestine meeting with solicitor Alastair Vance at his understated office in St. Mary's Square, a second shadow was introduced into the architecture of my quiet investigation. Callum Thorne, a veteran private investigator whose 20 years of navigating corporate espionage and domestic deceit had etched an expression of permanent, unreadable calm onto his features. Operating out of a modest office in Leeds, Thorne possessed an uncanny ability to unearth secrets buried beneath layers of corporate insulation. I provided him with the initial threads of my suspicion, the chilling hospital conversations, Julian's premature calculations regarding liquidity, Beatrice's casual downsizing of my home, and Marcus's chilling assurance that he knew where everything was stored. I instructed Thorne and Vance to look past the veneer of family devotion and dissect the financial arteries of Pendelton Logistics Limited. What they uncovered in the weeks that followed did not merely shatter the remaining illusions of my marriage. It laid bare an industrialized blueprint of betrayal executed by the very people I had sworn to protect. By the third week, Alastair Vance requested my presence at his office while Eleanor was supposedly attending a fitness class. Driving myself down Cold Bath Road and navigating the familiar streets to St. Mary's Square felt like crossing an invisible boundary from one reality into another. Inside Vance's private consultation room sat a leather-bound folder roughly the thickness of a small municipal ledger, a meticulous dossier chronicling 3 years of systematic corporate plunder. Pointing to the forensic audit, Vance laid out the breathtaking scale of Marcus Cooper's deception. Over the preceding 36 months, my stepson, the man I had promoted to operations director, mentored through high-stakes client dinners, and treated with the fierce devotion of a biological father, had systematically siphoned £500,000 from Pendelton Logistics Limited. The theft was not executed through clumsy embezzlement, but through a sophisticated web of inflated vendor invoices, fabricated operational expenses, and illegal capital transfers routed directly into a secretive shell corporation registered overseas under the name Cooper Logistics Ltd., an invisible drain completely shielded from standard internal audits unless one knew precisely where to look. Yet, the most staggering revelation was not the audacity of Marcus's theft, but the identity of his silent partner. Vance turned the page to reveal a matrix of corporate authorization logs bearing Eleanor's signature. Your wife, Vance stated with a clinical, steady gravity, co-signed 11 of these high-value transfers. As a senior stakeholder with signing authority on the corporate accounts, these funds could not have been moved without her explicit, knowing approval. The woman who had shared my bed for 30 years, who had wept theatrical tears at my hospital bedside and whispered hollow vows of devotion, had actively audited and sanctioned the systematic looting of the company I had built from a single room on Leeds Road. She had not merely stood by while her son bled my enterprise dry. She had held the basin for him. The final blow of that afternoon struck with the force of a physical tremor, exposing a conspiracy far more sinister than mere financial embezzlement. Pulling forward a series of legal documents retrieved directly from the county registry, Vance revealed that Marcus and Eleanor had anticipated my demise with terrifying bureaucratic efficiency. Months before the traffic collision on the A61, acting in precise concert, they had drafted a fraudulent lasting power of attorney, LPA, document bearing Eleanor's genuine signature alongside a meticulously forged replica of my own. The moment the medical team in the intensive care unit at Harrogate District Hospital indicated that my neurological prognosis was grim, Marcus had mobilized with predatory speed. Utilizing the fraudulent power of attorney, he had filed a fraudulent quitclaim deed at the property registry office, attempting to illegally transfer joint ownership of both our four-bedroom, detached sanctuary on Coldbath Road and our primary commercial warehouse facility on Leeds Road directly into his own name. They had not only plotted to terminate my life through the stroke of a DNAR pen, they had arranged to legally erase my very existence from the land and bricks I had labored a lifetime to secure, reducing 30 years of my blood, sweat, and sacrifices into an inheritance to be carved up by a thief and an adulteress. While Alistair Vance's forensic ledgers exposed the bleeding arteries of my corporate enterprise, the shadow investigator, Callum Thorne, delivered a separate dossier that completed the anatomy of my betrayal. 2 days after my review of the financial crimes, Thorne requested a discreet rendezvous at a quiet cafe on the outskirts of Leeds, sliding a thin manila folder across the small wooden table with the deliberate slowness of a man laying out crime scene photographs. You asked about the private life of Mrs. Pendelton, Thorne said, his voice entirely devoid of inflection. I suggest you take a steady breath before you open this. Inside were time-stamped surveillance logs, digital correspondence, and hotel booking receipts documenting a 14-month clandestine affair between Eleanor and a 34-year-old personal trainer named Oliver Davies, who operated out of a popular health club in Harrogate. The timeline struck me with the visceral impact of a physical blow. 14 months prior, Eleanor and I had attended a glittering New Year's gala hosted by neighbors on Coldbath Road. She had worn an elegant emerald gown, danced in my arms beneath a canopy of fairy lights, kissed me softly at the stroke of midnight, and whispered that this would be a wonderful year for us. Just 2 weeks after that tender evening, she had enrolled in personal training sessions with Oliver Davies, initiating a systematic descent into deception. The contrast between the decades of shared history, our quiet triumphs, our mutual support through the lean years, the profound intimacy of a life built brick by brick, and the sordid reality of secret trysts in anonymous guest houses while I labor at the office carved a deep, jagged chasm in my chest. I stared out the cafe window toward the gray Yorkshire sky, my hands trembling slightly against the porcelain rim of my teacup. 30 years of marriage were not merely fractured. They had been exposed as a hollow facade sustained by convenience and deceit. Yet, the rot within my family extended even further, reaching into the very core of Pendelton logistics through an internal conspiracy that implicated my biological children. To reconstruct this final layer of the puzzle, I turned to Glenn Ferris, a 44-year-old senior accounts manager who had served the company with unblemished loyalty for 6 years. Glenn was a man of uncompromising integrity, possessing a sharp analytical mind that had previously flagged suspicious ledger anomalies, only to be systematically demoted by Julian in an arbitrary exercise of petty authority because my son detested being corrected by someone more competent than himself. We met in a quiet tea room in the historic heart of Harrogate, where Glenn slid a digital thumb drive across the table, his eyes carrying the heavy exhaustion of a man harboring a dangerous truth for far too long. I knew those vendor accounts were manipulated, Glenn murmured, leaning in close. I flagged the discrepancies twice to management, and Julian silenced me. But it wasn't just Marcus orchestrating the plunder behind the scenes. Your daughter, Beatrice, was knee-deep in it as well. The revelation hit me with sickening clarity, shattering the final remnants of paternal illusion. Beatrice, my 25-year-old daughter, had stumbled upon the illicit financial transactions connecting Eleanor, Marcus, and the shell company Cooper Logistics LLC nearly a year earlier. Rather than fulfilling her moral obligation as a daughter and an executive stakeholder to expose the theft, Beatrice had chosen a far more parasitic path. Armed with digital proof of her mother's embezzlement and her stepbrother's corporate looting, she had leveraged her silence into a lucrative extortion scheme, demanding and receiving substantial monthly hush money kickbacks directly routed into her independent boutique fashion label in Knaresborough. Over the subsequent 10 days, working in precise coordination with Glenn Ferris, we reconstructed the entire architecture of the fraud with surgical, mathematical precision. 43 distinct fraudulent transactions totaling £500,000, executed over 3 years, while I drove home late along the A61 believing I was securing a prosperous future for my bloodline. In truth, I had spent my entire adult life constructing a magnificent estate only to watch my wife, my stepson, and my own biological children convert it into a feeding trough. Sitting in that quiet Harrogate tea room, surrounded by the irrefutable documentation of their collective greed, the final vestige of grief vanished from my soul, hardening into an absolute, unshakable resolve to administer a reckoning from which they could never recover. With the final pieces of the puzzle secured through Glenn Ferris's meticulous internal audits and Callum Thorne's unyielding surveillance, the architecture of my retribution was ready to be cast in stone. Over the course of the following week, Alastair Vance and I locked ourselves away in a quiet office overlooking St. Mary's Square to synthesize an irrefutable dossier of evidence. Every thread of their conspiracy was mapped with ruthless, forensic precision. The 43 fraudulent transactions totaling £500,000 routed through Cooper Logistics Ltd. The 14-month trail of infidelity linking Eleanor to Oliver Davies at the Harrogate Health Club. The forged lasting power of attorney complete with handwriting analysis. The security camera timestamps and audio transcript from the intensive care unit at Harrogate District Hospital capturing their chilling eagerness to terminate my life, and Beatrice's digital extortion receipts funding her boutique. Nothing was left to chance. Every allegation was anchored by primary documentation, turning a web of personal betrayal into an airtight legal construct capable of withstanding any courtroom scrutiny. Simultaneously, I executed a series of decisive, unyielding financial maneuvers designed to sever the economic lifeline they had taken for granted. Quietly and entirely within the boundaries of UK banking law, I exercised my full authority over our accumulated wealth, transferring every single penny, totaling £800,000, from our joint personal savings account, which Eleanor assumed I was too distracted to monitor, into an independent account established at an entirely separate financial institution under my sole name. The resources that had sustained their parasitic lifestyles were abruptly and permanently recalled to their true owner. Following this, I sat across from Alastair Vance to rewrite my final testament. The previous will had been a monument to parental indulgence, distributing my hard-earned estate generously among a family that viewed me as a liability. The new document, drafted with surgical legal clarity, was designed not to enrich, but to educate, a profound pedagogical instrument that would strip away their expectations and teach them the true cost of unbridled greed. With the legal mechanisms locked and loaded in Vance's drawer, waiting for the precise moment of execution, I turned my attention to the theatrical culmination of my strategy. Eleanor, entirely oblivious to the seismic forces gathering beneath her feet, had enthusiastically assumed the role of chief architect for our upcoming anniversary. With cheerful domestic serenity, she announced over a quiet evening meal in our Cold Bath Road home that she was planning a grand celebration to mark our 30th wedding anniversary. She spoke of inviting 14 neighboring couples from our affluent circle, our local vicar from the parish church, and all the members of our fractured family to a magnificent Saturday evening garden party scheduled for the final weekend of October. Absolute perfection, Eleanor. I had replied smoothly, looking straight into the eyes of the woman who had signed away my life while helping her son plunder my company. Let us make it an unforgettable evening, with everyone gathered together under one roof. She smiled warmly, reaching across the white linen tablecloth to squeeze my hand. I squeezed hers back with equal warmth, relishing the ironclad certainty that when the fairy lights flickered on across our terrace that autumn evening, they would illuminate not a celebration of marital longevity, but the grand theater of their total and unmitigated ruin. The final Saturday of October arrived, bringing with it one of those crisp, crystalline autumn evenings in Harrogate where the chill of the North Yorkshire air recedes just enough to invite quiet gatherings beneath open skies. Eleanor had spared no expense in orchestrating the celebration, transforming our private back garden on Cold Bath Road into an exquisite theater of deception. High cocktail tables draped in pristine white linen were arranged across the lawn. Delicate fairy lights were artfully strung through the boughs of the ancient oak trees, and a professional catering service from the town center circulated with trays of refined canapes and chilled champagne. 14 distinguished neighboring couples from our affluent circle, our respected local parish vicar, and the full assembly of my domestic lineage. Eleanor in her striking emerald evening gown, Julian nursing his second bourbon with casual entitlement, Beatrice maintaining a detached social poise, and Marcus carrying himself with the practiced air of a corporate heir, mingled effortlessly beneath the warm glow. To every outside observer, it was the idyllic portrait of a resilient family celebrating 30 unbreakable years of matrimonial harmony. Little did they know, Alistair Vance sat quietly in his park saloon car just down the residential street with an airtight dossier on the passenger seat, while two uniformed North Yorkshire police officers lingered in an unmarked vehicle 2 houses away. The stage was set, the audience was entirely captive, and the final act was about to commence. Stepping forward from the edge of the stone terrace, I raised a crystal flute filled with sparkling mineral water, tapped the rim lightly with a silver fork, and requested the attention of the gathering. The lively chatter across the garden subsided into a respectful, anticipatory hush. Eleanor offered a warm, radiant public smile from her place near the water feature. Julian lifted his glass with an eager, complacent grin. Beatrice turned with mild curiosity, and Marcus folded his arms with calculated confidence. I let my gaze sweep slowly over the faces of the people who had watched me build my life, lingering for a fraction of a second on the 3 individuals who had conspired to inherit my ruins before I ever drew my last breath. 30 years, I began, my voice carrying steady and clear across the lawn, unburdened by emotion. 30 years is a profound span of human existence. It is a period defined by sacrifice, relentless labor, and the architectural choices one makes in the quiet hope that they are building a sanctuary for those they love. Near death possesses a terrifying, clarifying purity. When I lay suspended within the cold silence of the intensive care unit at Harrogate District Hospital, stripped of my mobility and reduced to an observer of my own mortality, I had nothing left to do save for listening, remembering, and learning the true calculus of human devotion. Across the patio, Eleanor's head tilted slightly backward, the radiant public smile freezing on her lips as a sudden, imperceptible shift in atmospheric pressure chilled the evening air. Without waiting for their response, I reached down to a small mahogany side table resting beside my chair, lifting 4 heavy, cream-colored envelopes, each inscribed with a single name written in my precise, methodical handwriting. I walked slowly toward them, descending the terrace steps into the very center of the garden illumination, holding out the first envelope toward my son. "Julian," I said smoothly, my tone as polite as a corporate host distributing annual bonuses. "Every celebration deserves a token of remembrance. Tonight, I have prepared a life-changing gift for each of you, something that captures your true contributions to our family legacy." Julian stepped forward with the easy, arrogant stride of a young man anticipating a generous financial allotment or a deed to a new property, accepting the envelope with a faint, amused smirk. He pulled out the heavy cardstock insert, expecting a bank draft or a legal testament. But as his eyes scanned the printed text, the amused smirk began to drain away with the agonizing slowness of water emptying from a basin. Within his hands lay a verbatim, authenticated transcript of every single word he had uttered beside my hospital bed during my darkest hours in the ICU, highlighted with merciless precision. "Once probate clears, the trust starts paying out." I looked at the folder in his study last year. I know what my share is. I am Dadcozystories. I've been waiting. Beneath that damning dialogue lay an official executive directive issued by the Human Resources Department of Pendelton Logistics Ltd., dated precisely that morning. Notice of summary dismissal. Julian Pendleton is hereby terminated from all corporate affiliations, effective immediately. Your corporate fuel card is canceled as of midnight. The corporate lease agreement covering your personal vehicle is hereby revoked. The garden grew so intensely silent that the distant murmur of traffic on Cold Bath Road sounded like rolling thunder. I let the silence settle heavily over his collapsing posture before delivering the final, decisive blow. And should you harbor any remaining curiosities regarding your long-term financial security, I added quietly, "Be advised that my newly executed will formally amend your inheritance to the exact sum of £1,000. Do make certain to utilize it wisely for your much-desired liquidity." The word hung suspended in the crisp autumn air like a falling blade, permanently severing the illusions of a son who had traded his father's life for a date on his financial calendar. Without pausing to let the chilling shock of Julian's public dismantling settle over the gathering, I turned my measured gaze toward my daughter. Beatrice stood frozen near the edge of the illuminated terrace, her arms crossed defensively over her chest, as though she could physically ward off the exposure of her sins. I stepped toward her, extending the second heavy cream envelope, which she accepted with trembling fingers, her eyes wide with a mixture of terror and disbelief. Inside lay a duplicate of the ICU audio transcript, but for her, it featured a far more damning artifact, a high-resolution, time-stamped security photograph extracted from the Harrogate District Hospital digital archives, capturing the exact second on day 3 when she stood over my bed and urged the medical consultant to withdraw aggressive interventions because my survival inconvenienced her schedule. Below that photographic evidence rested a formal legal notice regarding her residential tenancy. "Your name is formally removed as my guarantor on your luxury apartment lease in Knaresborough as of Monday morning," I said, my voice carrying an unyielding, crystalline authority across the lawn. "You have precisely 30 days to secure a new co-signer, find a roommate, or relocate to accommodation more reflective of your independent financial standing. And much like your brother, my new testament allocates you the symbolic sum of £1,000. Spend it wisely upon your fashion boutique." Beatrice stared at the photograph, her mouth opening and closing soundlessly, utterly decimated as the illusion of her pampered independence crumbled into dust. My attention then shifted to Eleanor, who stood like a statue carved from ice in the center of the patio, surrounded by 14 pairs of stunned neighbors and our local parish vicar, all of whom had retreated into a guilty, breathless silence. Eleanor did not reach for her envelope. She simply stared at me with an expression of profound, terminal horror. I stepped forward and placed the heavy cream packet directly into her trembling hands. With agonizing slowness, she pulled back the flap, revealing the exhaustive surveillance report compiled by Callum Thorne. 14 months of digital correspondence, hotel receipts, and intimate date logs documenting her adulterous liaisons with Oliver Davies at the local Harrogate Health Club, conducted while I labored to build the very empire she was systematically dismantling. Directly beneath the evidence of her infidelity lay the forensic corporate audit bearing her signature alongside Marcus's across 11 fraudulent financial transactions, legally binding her to the theft of £500,000 from Pendelton Logistics Ltd., alongside the fraudulent lasting power of attorney documents engineered to strip away our Cold Bath Road home. Resting at the very bottom of the dossier was a file stamped by Alastair Vance's firm. Formal divorce proceedings, already drafted, processed, and filed through the family court system on Friday afternoon. 30 years of marriage, Eleanor, I said quietly, ensuring every single guest heard every syllable. 30 years, and you could not muster the patience to endure 7 days in an intensive care unit. My legal team filed for divorce yesterday due to the £500,000 stolen with your explicit signature. As for your financial settlement, my proposal is simple. The deed to that derelict, damp-ridden council flat we purchased as a distressed investment in Bradford back in 2003. You may reside there, or you may choose to explain your fraud directly to a high court judge. The choice is entirely yours. Eleanor turned an unnatural, ghostly pale, her body swaying slightly as reality finally crushed the elaborate lies she had lived behind for decades. Finally, my gaze locked on a Marcus Cooper. He stood rigidly near the wrought iron garden gate, his tailored blazer suddenly looking less like the uniform of a corporate executive and more like a convict's discarded costume. I did not offer him a paper envelope. Words on a page were entirely insufficient to capture the depth of his betrayal. Your biological father lacked the fortitude to raise you, leaving your mother destitute, I said, my tone hardening into an absolute, razor-sharp edge that cut through the silent night air. I married her when you were 6 years old, brought you into this home, provided you with a father's unconditional love, educated you, and ultimately handed you the keys to my enterprise, promoting you above men twice your experience. I called you my son, and for 3 years, you repaid that devotion by executing a systematic campaign of corporate plunder, stealing £500,000 across 43 fraudulent transactions. And the moment I defied your expectations by surviving, you were visibly disappointed. Marcus's jaw tightened into a rigid line of suppressed panic, his arrogant composure dissolving into the hollow desperation of a trapped animal. Matt, whatever you imagine you have, he stammered, his voice cracking. I imagine nothing, Marcus. I interrupted smoothly. I know everything. Solicitor Alastair Vance filed formal criminal complaints for identity theft, corporate fraud, and deed forgery with the North Yorkshire Police yesterday morning. The arrest warrants were officially signed and authorized at noon today. I turned slightly toward the shadow driveway, just beyond the garden wall. You may enter. The wrought iron gate swung open, and 2 uniformed police officers stepped firmly onto the lawn, their heavy footsteps echoing like a judgment upon the terrace. Marcus stared at me with a look of profound, devastating realization, the complete collapse of a man who had gambled his entire existence on the permanence of a dead man's silence. As the cold steel of the handcuffs clicked securely around his wrists, locking away the parasitic air of my destruction, the entire gathering stood in total, reverent awe, watching the exact moment poetic justice reclaimed its rightful throne. The heavy steel cuffs locked in a place around Marcus Cooper's wrists with a definitive, chilling snap that reverberated across the silent, breathless expanse of the garden on Cold Bath Road. The 2 North Yorkshire police officers gripped his arms with professional authority, turning the weeping, disgraced corporate director around and escorting him away through the side gateway under the stunned, unblinking gazes of 14 neighboring couples, our local parish vicar, and the fractured remnants of what once called itself a family. Eleanor remained frozen in place, a pale statue of absolute ruin, while Julian and Beatrice stared downward at the flagstones as though hoping the earth would open up and swallow their shame. The grand performance of their deceit had finally met the unyielding architecture of objective truth. I stood alone in the center of the terrace, the air around me feeling lighter, purer, and infinitely more breathable than it had at any point since the glass shattered on a 61 arterial road. I lifted my crystal flute once more, the remaining sparkling water catching the warm glow of the overhead fairy lights, and directed a calm, steady gaze toward our guests who stood paralyzed by the unfolding drama. I wish to extend my most sincere gratitude to each and every one of you for gracing our anniversary celebration with your presence tonight, I said, my voice carrying a quiet, resonant dignity that commanded the courtyard. I mean that with absolute sincerity. Please, do feel entirely welcome to partake of the buffet and the refreshments. The catering was chosen with utmost care. As for myself, my journey tonight leads elsewhere. With those measured words, I set my glass down upon the mahogany table, ensuring it rested clean and empty. At 58 years of age, I possessed decades of healthy, productive life ahead of me, unburdened by parasites, untethered from deceit, and completely restored to my own sovereign integrity. I buttoned the lapels of my tailored jacket, turned my back upon the grand illusion of my former marriage, and walked deliberately through the French doors into the house, traversing the quiet hallway for the final time. My overnight bag had rested packed in the hallway since Thursday afternoon, a quiet testament to a transition long prepared. Stepping through the front door of the Cold Bath Road residence, I left behind 30 years of fabricated loyalty, ungrateful heirs, and institutionalized betrayal, pulling the heavy timbered door shut behind me with a soft, definitive click. The night air of Harrogate was cool and filled with the crisp promise of an autumn evening as I unlocked my saloon car, slid behind the steering wheel, and pointed the vehicle's bonnet northward toward the open highway. A solitary text message buzzed softly from the mobile phone resting on the passenger seat, an incoming plea from Eleanor, which I bypassed without a single second thought. 3 minutes later, I pulled safely to the roadside, typed out a single, precise sentence, and hit send. I heard every word. With that final closure, I dropped the handset deep into the glove box, rolled down the window to let the steady rush of the North Yorkshire wind sweep away the ghost of yesterday, and drove forward into the dawn of a liberated life. They had wished for my permanent silence, hoping to inherit the fruits of my lifelong labor through cowardice and deception. Instead, I delivered unto them something far more enduring, the unvarnished truth laid bare before the entire world, proving for all time that true retribution requires neither raised fists nor petty rage. It is forged entirely through the serene patience of immutable truth, the unyielding machinery of the law, and the quiet justice of ensuring that every human soul receives precisely what they have labored to construct with the true measure of their own character.